Thank you all for coming out today. Quickly, before I start, just want to point out that today is Global Accessibility Awareness Day, May 18th. So thank you all for coming out today. And if you want to use the GAAD hashtag as you are tweeting and things like that, that would be very awesome. So yeah, my name is Rob Dotson. I'm a developer advocate on the Chrome team. And today I'm going to be talking about accessibility for teams. So this talk came about because I guess kind of at the beginning of the quarter, I had a partner reach out to me and they were like, hey, Rob, our team is getting started with accessibility and kind of wondering if I had any material to help them get ramped up and get started. And I was like, oh, yeah, sure. And I sent them an email with like a front-end developer course that I put together with a teammate of mine, and I sent them some automated build tools and things like that. And they followed up a few days later and they were like, hey, thanks, that was really helpful, but like, what about your designers? And what about your project managers and everybody else on the team? Like, do you have them just do this course? Or like, how are you teaching the rest of the folks about accessibility? And it made me stop for a second and realize that oftentimes when we're talking about accessibility, it's easy to get kind of really laser focused on like one particular discipline or another and only talk about, hey, here's what developers need to know, or hey, here's what designers need to know. But really, accessibility is a team effort. No one person is responsible for the overall design and experience and implementation for a site. And accessibility touches all of these things. So every person on the team has some role to play in the process of making the experience accessible and usable by as many folks as possible. And so what I wanted to do today was just go through 3 of the key stakeholders in the creation of a project and discuss some of the action items that I think each of these folks can undertake and incorporate into their process to make sure that accessibility is like a top line item for them. It's always on their radar as they're working. So I want to start off by talking about the project manager role. And I think the overriding goal for a project manager in any project is just to kind of make sure that accessibility is incorporated into the major milestones as folks are staging builds, as designers are showing comps, and as we're moving through the process of shipping our product, that we're always thinking about it, that it's always on our radar, and we're asking ourselves things, like where can we be improving? How do we avoid regressing and things like that? How do we check where we currently are and how well we're doing? And so I wanted to come up with a few key items that I think the project manager needs to keep in mind as they're working through their process. So I'm going to go through each of these in more detail, but from a high level, as a PM, I'd want to make sure that my team is receiving training, that I'm identifying the critical user journeys in my app, I'm incorporating some sort of accessibility checklist into our process, and I'm evaluating the product with user studies if I have that opportunity. So let's dive into these in more detail, starting with that first one, making sure everyone on your team receives training. Now, I have done projects before where I have been the quote-unquote accessibility owner, meaning I was the only person who had been trained or was versed in it at all. And that's a really tough position to be in. Because when you're the only person working on it, you kind of have to keep an eye on everybody, right? And it's very, very difficult because it can often feel like the whole team is sort of racing ahead, implementing features and shipping stuff, and you're just trying to run kind of behind them and throw some fixes over their shoulder and hope that some things land. So I think it's good to have an accessibility champion or someone who's driving that work, but I also think it's really important to make sure that everyone on the team has some training in this area and has some fundamentals established. To give you an analogy, we would never say, hey, everybody on the team, you can all write whatever code you want, and Lisa will make it run fast, right? We would never treat like performance that way, but oftentimes we do treat accessibility that way. It's just, it's that one person's job, but it doesn't really work well that way. So there's a lot of free resources out there for training your team up on accessibility. Myself and a teammate named Alice Boxall, we put together a Udacity course. So this is a free online multi-week course to get any sort of front-end developer up and running. We cover topics like focus, built-in semantics, ARIA, accessible styling with CSS, a little bit of tooling and testing in there. We also have taken all of this material and put it on developers.google.com/web in written format. So if you prefer something you can search around. This is a live doc set. We're always updating it. So we also have new guides that we publish up there as well. And for your designers, we've also got the material design accessibility guidelines. I really like this document because it has a lot of examples of do's and don'ts and suggestions on how you can improve the accessibility from a visual standpoint in your app. So there's just some resources that you can give to your team. And what I would encourage you to do is make sure that your team has time during the work week to learn this, right? Don't just send them off and be like, hey, learn this on your free time, right? Carve out some time at the beginning of a project to go through this training and make sure everyone's on board. The next thing I would suggest is, as you're starting off your app, identify the critical user journeys in your experience. So this is going to help you kind of scope the work ahead, right? And to give you an example, a critical or like a primary user journey is going to be something like a basic task that every user is going to have to perform in order to use your app. You know, the sort of a critical thing, like if you're building an e-commerce site, that the user can add an item to their shopping cart. That's something everybody's got to do in order to even use the experience, right? So you want to identify these primary user journeys. And you can also identify your secondary user journeys, things that might be, you know, infrequently performed by everyday users, stuff that maybe only power users are going to do, like being able to change your avatar in the settings menu or something like that. Once you have these primary and secondary user journeys figured out, then you can actually start to incorporate an accessibility checklist. And I'll actually show a few examples of this in a second, and start to kind of like see how your user journeys apply to that checklist. So the nice thing about pulling in a checklist is, if you're retrofitting accessibility onto a current site, using a checklist will allow you to sort of, you know, audit where you currently are, triage what work needs to be done. If you're starting a new project, then you can incorporate that checklist early into your process and make sure, as you're, you know, going through milestones, that you're doing reviews against that checklist. So some example checklists. There is a WebAIM checklist for WCAG 2A. This is primarily geared towards web developers, but it's a really nice sort of distillation of the WCAG guidelines and an easy-to-follow guide. You can just, you know, go through and check those off real fast. If you prefer something that's split up by discipline, the folks at Vox Media have also produced a similar checklist. So this one, it's kind of bucketed by the different roles on the team. So here's what your designer would be doing. Here's what your, you know, QA staff would be doing. Here's what your editorial folks will be doing, right? Either one of these is a great choice for self-assessment of your project. There's other ones out there. If you just Google like accessibility checklist, there's a number of them. I would suggest just find whichever one, you know, fits your work style best. And then once you've got that checklist, you can start to apply it to those user journeys that you've identified. So by identifying these user journeys, applying the checklist to them, we can start to get really, really tactical about our accessibility work. So something that I've seen teams do before is they'll actually build a matrix. And they'll have their primary use cases as rows and their secondary use cases as rows, and then those checklist items as columns. So a primary user journey, right? A user can add an item to their shopping cart. OK, there's a lot of steps involved there. For all those steps along that journey, can we assert that we have good color contrast, that our controls are labeled, and so on and so on? And so this way you can be really tactical about it. You can actually start to give yourself goals. You can say, all right, by Q2 of 2017, all of our basic accessibility checks will pass for primary user journeys and things like that. So you can actually score your work and figure out if you're making progress or if you're regressing. And I would encourage you to don't just do this checklist once at the beginning of the project and forget about it, right? Make sure you're incorporating it into all the major milestones. So when you're seeing builds from your developers or designs from your designer, run through that checklist with your QA team and say, all right, cool. Did we make progress? Did we regress? You know, or do we need to improve some things before we launch this build? And that'll help you stay on top of your overall progress. And then finally, I would say if you're retrofitting, or sorry, if you have the opportunity to, incorporate some user studies into your process. You know, sit down with folks who maybe use assistive technology. If you're retrofitting accessibility onto an existing project, this will help you identify some critical pain points for some of those users. If you're starting a new project, then it's good because you can start doing these user journeys early with your prototypes, and you're going to avoid having to redo work later down the line when someone actually uses it and says, oh, you know, maybe this thing doesn't work as well as we think. You know, I think it's entirely possible to make something that is technically accessible, but like not very usable. And so sitting down and doing some actual user journeys will help you identify those situations. And that way you can, you know, catch those problems early, and you don't have to avoid redoing that work over and over. So yeah, these are the top line items that I would encourage every project manager just to sort of have in their back pocket as they're thinking about how they can incorporate accessibility into their process a bit more. Moving on, I want to talk about the UX designer. So I think the challenge for UX is that we tend to design with sort of, you know, using our own biases, right? And so if you don't have a disability or impairment, you don't have a colleague with a disability or impairment, then it's easy to forget that you might be designing in a bubble, right? And so you want to ask yourself, as you're designing, who is my design excluding? And work through creating different personas, folks who would see and experience the world differently from you, and try and figure out how would these users engage with my experience. It's also important to remember that our bodies are not static, right? We're constantly changing all the time. As we age, we may develop disabilities related to vision, hearing, range of motion. I saw a stat recently that said by 2050, around 2 billion people will be over the age of 60. And I'm going to imagine they're going to still use the internet. And they're going to still use their phones and whatever devices we're using in 2050, right? But vision, range of motion might not be what it is today. So keep in mind that we're changing for the sort of the constant, evolving and changing human body and human experience. And also understand that our context is also always changing. We take our computers with us now. They're in our pocket, right? And so we're not always using them in ideal scenarios. You might be using your phone outside on a very bright, sunny day like today, and you might have a difficult time reading that screen, right? It might be useful for it to have some additional contrast. So there are many reasons why you might be situationally or temporarily impaired. And when we incorporate that into our design process, when we design inclusively, we end up making a more satisfying experience for many more users. So these are the key items that I would want a designer to keep in mind as they are going through their process. Making sure that they've got good color contrast, that tab order is identified, and we'll talk about what that means in just a sec, that their controls have good labels, and that you've got multiple ways to interact with your UI. So let's dive into these in more detail, starting with color contrast, because this is a big one. I see a lot of sites kind of struggling with this. So the way that we measure contrast is in terms of luminance. We're doing a comparison between the foreground and the background color. And at a minimum, we want a contrast ratio of about 4.5 to 1 for smaller text. So this is text that's smaller than 14 point bold or smaller than 18 point. And for any text that's above that, we can go to a contrast ratio of 3 to 1. So I've got some examples here. Over there on the right-hand side, you see some larger text at the top that satisfies that larger contrast ratio, some smaller text below that. And then next to it, you see some fields here which aren't quite satisfying that minimum ratio. And even for folks in this room, I'm imagining that these other fields over here are a little difficult to read, right? And so there's a number of good tools that we can use as we're doing our design process to make sure we are nailing those contrast ratios. So the material design team have made a very nice color palette tool. You can go through, you can pick some colors that'll actually lay them out a little bit in your design. But what I think is really awesome is this accessibility tab, which will show you when it's safe to use either light text or dark text on that background color. It'll throw little warning signals at you to indicate, like, hey, you maybe can't use dark text on this particular background. And it'll also indicate minimum opacity levels that are safe for your text and that satisfy those contrast requirements. And you can also go in and drop in your own hex values as well. Another tool that I use all the time is this contrast ratio tool by Leah Veru. This is great for doing quick spot checks in your app. Right? You just drop a background color in, a foreground color, and it'll tell you the contrast ratio. So you can very quickly identify whether you're on the bubble, maybe you just need to tweak it a little bit, or if things are kind of way off and you got to go back and really address your color palette. Once you've got your colors squared away, the next thing is to tackle your tab order. So what do I mean by that? So your tab order is the order in which elements are going to receive focus as the user is pressing the tab key on their keyboard. And ideally, your tab order should be flowing from the top of the page down to the bottom, kind of starting in the top left, flowing down to the bottom right. And we want it to follow the visual layout of the page. And it's also nice if our more important elements can be kind of higher up in the tab order. So someone using a keyboard primarily to navigate has a more efficient experience. They don't have to tab through a million things to get down to the important controls, like add this item to my shopping cart. Something to note here is, so this is something that a UX designer can sit down. They can actually indicate all of the interactive controls in a comp. They can number them to say this is the order and the sequence that these things should be focusable. In general, you only want interactive controls to be part of your tab order. You don't need to focus like images or headers or text or anything like that. Just stuff that a user is going to interact with, provide input to, something like that. And you can hand that off to your developer and make sure they implement that. And there's a very cool tool called Chrome Lens. This is a Chrome extension. And what it'll do is it'll actually let you sort of identify the tab order in your site. So I'll show you how you can trace your tab order. And as I'm tabbing through this experience, it'll draw these little red lines to show me where the focus was and the tab order of this experience. And so what you're looking for is something that's flowing, down the page in a nice fashion. You definitely want to avoid things where it's like focus is moving off screen and coming back, or going to the bottom of the page and back to the top and bouncing around like all bonkers, right? So this is something you can also hand off to your developer and say, hey, this is the flow that we're going for in our experience. Next is making sure that your controls have accessible labels. And I consider this part of the user experience, so I consider this something that falls into the UX designer's wheelhouse. So the idea with this is, particularly for controls that we might not have room to put text on screen, I want to figure out what that control is going to announce for a screen reader user. And there's a few kind of key rules here. The first is that we want to be succinct in the way we announce these controls. So it's very tedious to listen to long descriptions if you're using a screen reader. So say as little as you can that's still relevant and super important. You don't need to include things like the control type in the label, because that will be announced if the developer is using the correct element. That should just be announced implicitly. Instead, what you really want to do is you want to focus on action verbs. So when we're going through and we're identifying all the controls on our page and the label that should be announced, we want to do things like say, hey, this button's going to say search instead of magnifying glass, because magnifying glass doesn't really tell me anything. Search tells me the action that's about to happen when I click on that control or interact with that control using my keyboard. So go through and, as you're sort of doing the comps for your page, identify these elements, figure out what those labels should be, and then you can hand that off to your developer who can implement that using things like ARIA. Finally, I want to make sure that I'm providing multiple ways to interact with my UI. So in particular, it's very easy to get into the habit of just designing for like a mouse-only or mouse-first interface and forget that folks may be interacting with your controls using a keyboard, and you need to plan all of the various focus states that will be appearing in your design. So we've got a drop-down widget here. What's it going to look like when someone's hitting the up and down arrow keys, right? Even though it seems like, yeah, of course I would do that, I've worked on a number of projects where many of the focus states were not thought out by the designer in the initial comps. And then you have your developer kind of filling that in, sort of taking their best guess at what they think a focus state should be for something. So if this is something that can go into the actual initial UX design of the project, that makes it a lot easier for everybody. And another thing to keep in mind is that you want to avoid conveying information using only one modality. So consider multiple ways of conveying information to the user. So if I'm doing something like validation, right, the example over here that's just the red underline, if I'm a user with a color vision deficiency, I might miss that as being an invalid state. So if we use multiple modalities for conveying information, we have the red underline plus some helper text to tell the user, hey, something's wrong here, then we're more likely to kind of cover our bases better and make sure that the user does get that information conveyed to them. All right, so these are my big items for the designer to keep in mind, making sure they got good color contrast. Tab order and labeling is well identified. You can hand that off to your developer, and that you're making sure you're planning for multiple ways to interact with and understand the content on your site. Finally, we got our developer. And the idea with the developer is they're kind of managing a few different things. They're handling focus in the page. They're handling semantics. They're handling good CSS styles. We're combining all this stuff together to create a really nice, robust experience. I'm a front-end developer primarily by trade, so while everybody else got 4 checklist items, the developer gets 6. I'm just more familiar with that. So making sure we got a good tab order, we're managing focus properly, we've got good keyboard support throughout, we're using ARIA and other things to convey semantics where needed, and then finally, because being lazy is good, we are automating as much of our process as possible. So let me dive into each of these, starting with the tab order. So the designer hands us that comp that says, hey, this is the order that I want things to flow in the document. Cool. How do we actually implement that? There's a number of HTML elements that you work with every day that are implicitly in the focus order. So button, input, select, right? Anyone can hit tab, land on these controls, and they have built-in keyboard support, which is great. So wherever possible, using native controls is going to get us a long way towards nailing that good tab order. It's also important to note, though, that not every element is focusable. So images and paragraphs, divs, spans, these elements are not automatically opted into the tab order. And so problems arise when we use those elements to build custom controls, and we don't do the extra work needed to add proper keyboard support to them. So I'll show you an example here. This is one that I actually took from a pretty popular UI framework. So this is your classic hamburger menu responsive design button thing for opening your side nav. And as implemented right now, it's a div, right? And so if you're watching my focus indicator up there, as I'm trying to tab over to that control, because it's just a div, and because to the browser a div is just sort of a generic grouping element, that element is not focusable. And that means that a user using a keyboard is just never going to be able to open that side nav. And I see this on a lot of websites. The trick here is to use the proper element, right? Again, take advantage of native HTML whenever you can, because the platform is trying to help you out by doing implicit or opting elements into the tab order for you. So instead of a div, we use a button. Button is totally stylable, right? It'll announce properly to a screen reader. And now my user can just tab over to that control and press spacebar, and it opens the side nav. Notice I said spacebar there. So another side benefit of using the button element is if you add a click handler to it in JavaScript, the button element has this magical thing called synthetic click activation. So when you land on it and you press spacebar or enter, it'll actually run your click handler for you. So this is not something that a div or a span can do out of the box. If you're making custom controls with divs or span, you got to listen for the keyboard event. You got to check the key type, right? And button's just going to give you that for free, which is really cool. I'm so obsessed with this that I actually shot a video on it just called Just Use Button. There's a lot of other cool things about buttons that I'm not even talking about yet. I feel like developers have forgotten this tag exists, but it's super, super useful. So yeah, shameless self-promotion. Go check out that YouTube video. The next thing to cover is making sure that we're properly managing focus and that it's visible in the app. So what do I mean by managing focus? Basically, when you're changing the content of the page, it's important to direct the user's focus to that new content. So for instance, if you're opening a modal window, right, or you're sliding up a notification from the bottom of the screen or something like that, if a user is using a screen reader, they may not get any indication that suddenly there's new content on screen. But by directing focus to that new content, we can tell that user about it. So I'll show you an example here. This is another pretty common one that I see. So here I'm using VoiceOver on mobile Safari, which is an extremely common sort of mobile screen reader OS combo. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go click on that hamburger menu button using my screen reader. So I double tap to click on it. It opens my side nav. It looks like I'm in the side nav, but I'm actually still on the hamburger menu. And as I'm swiping, now I'm just interacting with the links behind the overlay, which is not what we want in our user experience. But I see this on sites all the time. If you have not done anything to direct the user's focus into that side nav, they're behind the overlay. They're interacting with the page when they probably shouldn't be. So how do we fix this? This is my implementation for my side nav right now. It's pretty simple. What I can do is I can take something like this header element here. I can give it a tab index of -1, which means it's programmatically focusable. So the user's not going to reach it pressing the tab key on their keyboard. But I can call its focus method. I can direct focus to this control. So now I can listen for the transition event when my menu slides in. I call focus on that control, and now I've directed the user's focus into that. They can quickly get to the navigation links that they wanted to interact with. And I don't have them behind the overlay messing around with the page when they shouldn't be. Another kind of flip side to this is sometimes we actually want to retain focus in a particular area. We sort of want to trap it. We want to make sure that it doesn't break out. Right? Like if you open a modal window, you want the user to take action. You don't want them to accidentally end up behind your overlay again. And there are also situations when you want to prevent focus from entering an area. So I'll show you another example, again, using the side nav, because it's a very helpful example. So I want you to watch my sort of focus indicator here. And what's going to happen is it's going to start on the hamburger button. It'll disappear for a little while. And it'll appear again on this anchor tag in the page that says, click me. So what's happening is, because my side nav is off screen and it's full of anchors, the user is actually tabbing off screen. Focus is just sort of moving off screen, and they're interacting with things that's not even visible on the page. I see this on a lot of websites as well. They'll have modal windows that are in the DOM, but are just positioned off screen because they haven't displayed them yet. And they don't think the user can get to them, but they absolutely can using their keyboard. And someone using a screen reader or someone navigating primarily using their keyboard, they're hitting those things all the time. So we want to prevent focus from going into those off-screen elements. There's a couple ways you can do this. The most straightforward is just to say, hey, if something's off screen, I make it display none or visibility hidden. Now it's not in the accessibility tree. Now it's not in the tab order. But I want to talk about another method, which is something that we're also working on in Chrome. And this is the new inert attribute. So this is a new global HTML attribute that will remove an element and its descendants from the tab order and the accessibility tree. Let me show you why this is useful. So same scenario here, except for this time my nav has an inert attribute, and my main body content over there does not. So I'm tabbing, and my focus only goes in between my main content and the navigation bar in case the user wants to leave the site or something like that. That's totally cool. We want to allow that. But so far, this doesn't really give me anything different from display none. Well, let's say the drawer is open now. OK, cool. So we just move inert to the main content. So now you can't interact with the stuff behind the overlay, but you can interact with the nav. In fact, you can only interact with the nav. So now the user is tabbing through, and they're only interacting with the thing that they should be interacting with at that time. So this is really useful, for instance, if you have a modal window that you just opened, you direct the user focus there, and you keep it there until the user has taken an action of some kind. If you're interested in playing around with inert, we actually have a polyfill for this up on GitHub. So I'd love for folks to try it out and tell us what they think. If it helps, if it hurts, let us know. And hopefully, we're going to try and ship this in a flag or behind a flag in Chrome very soon. The other key point here is making sure that we're managing focus and that it's visible. So this is another issue that I see on a lot of sites. Focus rings or focus indicators in CSS, that can be sort of a tough situation sometimes, because it often feels like the browser is displaying focus rings in a very haphazard fashion, so to speak. So I'll show you an example here. I've got an input text field. I got a regular native button. And then I've got a button element that I've just styled to look kind of fancy. Right? We'll say that's our fancy button. OK? So when I go and I click these different controls, you can see that the focus ring behavior is different kind of for each one. So I see a focus ring on the input. I don't see it on the native button. And I do see it on my fancy button, even though it's the same element. Right? That's kind of weird. And I see that a lot of developers hit this. And they're like, I wasn't expecting that blue focus ring on that last control. They go to Stack Overflow. They're like, how do I get rid of the focus ring? And then someone's like, oh, you just say outline none, and you just remove all of them. OK? And this is a huge anti-pattern. Please do not do this. Again, remember, if someone's navigating with a keyboard, the focus ring, that's like their mouse pointer. OK? And if that thing goes away, it'd be like if I took your mouse pointer away, and you'd be like, I don't know what I'm about to click on. Right? So we want to avoid that situation. But I also understand why it happens, right? Because it seems sort of inconsistent what's going on here. So to help with this, we're working on a new CSS selector. This is actually just landed in CSS selectors level 4. It's called Focus Ring. It's a pseudo class. And Focus Ring today will help sort of differentiate between mouse and keyboard focus. And the way that it works is it matches whenever an element has focus, and based on an underlying browser heuristic, the browser has decided it should draw a focus ring. OK, what does that mean? Today, it means the underlying browser heuristic just basically says the user is using a keyboard. So focus matches, and I've determined the user is using a keyboard. Well, there's a lot of cool things that we can do now that we have the opportunity to opt into this heuristic. For instance, a site, or maybe Chrome itself, could expose a user preference. That someone could say, you know what? I always want to see focus rings on everything that I click on. It helps me keep my context. It keeps me from getting lost on the page. I'm going to check that as user preference. Cool. OK, we'll just say that you now have opted into the heuristic, and focus ring will match. So there's a cool opportunity here to start allowing users to customize the experience for how they see focus indicators. So thinking about that fancy button that I was showing there, we could do something like this, where we could say, all right, let's override the default focus style, because it's kind of being applied haphazardly. And instead, we'll make sure we create an indicator for when focus ring matches. So what that allows us to do then is, as the user is clicking with their mouse between these different elements, we get consistent behavior between our two buttons. And when they're tabbing through with a keyboard, we now have the focus indicator on all of our controls. So this helps us kind of differentiate mouse and keyboard focus, and we get kind of a more consistent feel to our app. We also have a polyfill for focus ring that is also up on GitHub. So we'd love for folks to try that out as well and let us know what they think. Yeah, any feedback here? Greatly appreciated. Next, we want to talk about how we give interactive elements good keyboard support. So when I was first getting into accessibility, I would build a custom control, and then I'd be like, I'm not quite sure everything I need to add to this control to make sure I can say it's keyboard accessible. You know, like what's supposed to happen when you hit different arrow keys? I felt like I was kind of guessing. And I discovered this awesome document. And it doesn't look like an awesome document. It looks like a boring document. But this is an awesome document, OK? So this is the ARIA Authoring Practices Guide. I know it has the classic like spec look that makes every developer just like fall asleep. But what this does is it lists a bunch of UI patterns. And you can pick a UI pattern, and it'll take you to a section where it will just tell you the expected keyboard support for that UI pattern. So if you're building a radio group, it'll say, OK, cool. When the user presses the down arrow, this is what should happen. When they press the spacebar, this is what should happen. When they press the home key or the end key, some of those keys that we sometimes overlook or forget about, right? This is what should happen. So this is like your cheat sheet to component accessibility. I love this doc so much. If you take nothing else from this talk, ARIA Authoring Practices Guide. Yes, take that with you, OK? A pattern that I use a lot when I'm implementing these is called roving tab index. So roving tab index is a good way to manage the focus at the component level. And the idea here is, let's say we're building a list box. We might have 100 items in that list box. And it would be very annoying for the user to have to tab through every item. So instead, we want the entire control just to be one tab stop. When the user lands on it, if they want to interact with it, they can like hit the up and down arrow key or something like that. And so to handle those arrow key presses, what we can do is we can give every child here a tab index of -1, except for the currently active child. We'll give that one a tab index of 0, which means it's in the natural keyboard tabbing order. So someone tabbing will tab to this control. They'll just land right on that element. If they press the down arrow key, we'll listen for that, and we'll just say, oh, cool. I'll just move tab index 0 to the next child, and I'll call focus on it. And now if they tab out of the control and they shift tab back in, they're going to land right back on the previous active item. So this is actually how I implement keyboard support in almost all of my controls. I'm just listening for certain arrow keys. I just find the child that tab index needs to move to, and I call focus on it. It's that straightforward. I actually shot a video on this if you're interested. I do this show on YouTube every 2 weeks called AlleyCast. I should have maybe mentioned that before, but yeah, so we have an episode on roving tab index and how to build your own radio group. If you're interested in that as well, definitely go check that out. All right, cool. So we've got keyboard support kind of squared away. The next thing is making sure we've got good ARIA support in our custom controls that we're building, making sure that they're being announced properly by a user who's using assistive technology. So again, the ARIA Authoring Practices Guide, this is why I love this document so much. It'll also, obviously, as the name implies, tell you what ARIA attributes and roles and states to apply and when to apply them. So going back to that doc, if we're building a checkbox, it'll just say, OK, cool, you're building a checkbox. It's got to have role equals checkbox. It's got to have ARIA checked equals true or false, depending on its state. It needs to have a label via ARIA labeled by. And we'll talk about how that works a little bit later. Right? But again, this is just your cheat sheet. You go there. If you're new to accessibility, or you're just building some components and you want to make sure they're good, solid components, check them against the Authoring Practices Guide patterns, make sure you're implementing all this stuff, and have a much happier time. So yeah, I mentioned ARIA labeled by. I want to talk about how we label these controls, because labeling is super, super important. Basically, labeling of our controls helps the user really understand the purpose of that particular control, what's about to happen when they interact with it, right? There's a few ways that we can go about doing this. If you are familiar with the label element, which we often use inside of forms, that is a good way to label controls. It primarily works, just on form elements like input, select, button, things like that. So it's not going to help us if we're building custom controls, like things like a web component or something that hasn't existed in the browser before. If you're using any sort of built-in form element, this is a great tool. So you can wrap an element in it. You can reference an element using the for attribute of the label element. And then up there at the top, in green, I've got some text that my screen reader would announce. So in this case, I'm wrapping this input element. And my screen reader, when it lands on it, is going to say first name, edit text. Cool. All right, so this helps us if we're using some native form inputs. But what if we're doing something else? Maybe we don't have a place to display text on screen. So the hamburger menu, great example of this. I see a lot of websites which don't do this. And so you land on that thing using a screen reader, and it just says button. And I'm not inclined to click on a button that just says button and nothing else, because that could be the send you my social security number button. So I'm not going to press that, right? So what we can do when we have a control where there isn't a place to put text on screen is we can give it its own little text alternative using the aria label attribute. So this will override any sort of like default labeling mechanism this control might have. It just allows us to create like a good text replacement. So for our hamburger menu, we can just give it an aria label of main menu. If the user lands on that using a screen reader, it says main menu button. Awesome. We know what we're interacting with. Finally, we've got aria labeled by. So this one's pretty interesting. It basically lets an element point at another element and say, hey, that element over there, that element provides my label. So an example would be I have a button that says shop now. And if a user lands on that, it says shop now, right? It's like, well, OK, but which section of the store am I going to? If we want, we can take that header up there that says men's outerwear, and we can use aria labeled by on our button, and we can point at not only that element, but we can even point at ourselves. You can actually have sort of these like compound aria labeled bys just by pointing to multiple space-separated IDs. And you can build sort of this like composite label. So I'm saying now, it's when I land on that button, it says men's outerwear, shop now, button. Cool. So these are some useful tools when you're building custom controls. Make sure you're labeling them so that way the user's understanding the purpose of that particular input widget that they're working with. Finally, you're doing all this work. You want to make sure that you're not regressing and missing errors or perhaps overlooking a part of your site. So this is where automation is really going to help us out. So there's a number of really great tools that will kind of make it easier for you to catch accessibility errors and fix them. One that I really like is a tool called Axe by the folks at DQ. So it comes in various flavors. There's Axe Core, the node module. There's Axe CLI, which you can just run from your terminal and like point at a URL. They have examples on using Axe with Selenium WebDriver. Really, really cool library. So definitely go check that out on GitHub. Super useful. And this is the kind of thing which, if you recall, I was talking about having an accessibility checklist earlier. This is the sort of thing where you can use that with your checklist to sort of automate some of those checks. So you don't have to do everything manually, which is very helpful. Some of you may have also seen a project that we are working on called Lighthouse. So this is for auditing like a progressive web app, making sure it's performant and doing all the best practices. Under the hood, Lighthouse actually relies on Axe Core. So when we generate a report for you, we have an accessibility section. You can hop down there, and the tests that we're exposing here are the ones that we're leveraging from the Axe library. So if you're already using Lighthouse today, you're already using Axe, which is really cool. And you can do something like this to kind of get a report card, get a little score, and kind of figure out roughly where you stand with accessibility in your existing project. And finally, for like spot checking things, it can be very tedious to have to turn on your screen reader every time you want to check just like a particular control or see if changing something is fixing it. So we're actually working on some experimental new accessibility dev tools. So these are available in Chrome today behind a flag. So you can go into Chrome flags / enable dev tools experiments. I'll also make these slides available after the talk, so you don't have to like write all these URLs down. You can go here, turn on developer tools experiments. You'll have to restart Chrome. You go to your dev tools, you go to the settings, and you go to the experiments tab. You enable accessibility inspection. And then you can actually just go look at like nodes in your elements panel, and along with your styles and your computed properties and everything, we now have an accessibility inspector that'll tell you, whether your element has proper labeling or not, or what the screen reader is about to announce. It shows you the name computation algorithm, which is really helpful. It tells you the ARIA role, the ARIA states that are currently applied to your elements. You can identify if you've got any issues there. Yeah, super useful stuff. So yeah, this is my checklist for the developer. Logical tab order, properly managing focus, good keyboard and ARIA support, and automate as much as you can to catch any errors or regressions. So wrapping up, again, I want to remind everyone, accessibility is a team effort. It's really, really difficult if you only have one person doing this on your team. It's so much better when everybody is bought in, everybody has some fundamentals and is able to contribute to this together. These are, again, sort of the high-level goals for each of these folks. I want the project manager to make sure that they're training the team, that everyone has time to learn about this topic, that you're identifying your use cases, that you're incorporating a good checklist. Your designer is understanding the needs of the users and making sure that they're designing inclusively, and that your developer is managing focus indicators, got good keyboard support, you're handling your semantics through things like ARIA. Again, quick refresh of some of the resources. We have our accessibility course. This is on Udacity today. It is a free multi-week course at bit.ly/web A11Y. My YouTube series, Alleycast, if you want to check this out, comes out fortnightly, every 2 weeks. We talk about not only accessibility fundamentals, but also the cool stuff, the bleeding edge stuff, the hip new specs and standards, and what's kind of around the corner. Also, check out our guides on web fundamentals, and check out the material design guidelines as well. I think this is a really, really good resource for designers. With that, I just want to say thank you so much for being with me today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your time here at I/O.